In court, my wife stood as if victory was already hers, speaking with confidence that the inheritance belonged entirely to her, while whispers around the room painted me as defeated before the case had even begun. She claimed the business I nurtured, the house I maintained, and the money I had safeguarded through years of sacrifice, presenting herself as the rightful owner of everything my father entrusted to me. People nodded as if her words carried the weight of truth, and I felt the sting of humiliation sharper than any insult, because loyalty and patience seemed erased in a single moment of spectacle. I kept my hand steady, waiting for the time when paper would speak louder than performance, because years earlier I had left a contract signed in her hand, one she believed irrelevant when she signed it, but one that now carried the full weight of my father's foresight. When the judge read it aloud, her smile disappeared before the final sentence left his lips, and I understood that the humiliation I carried would soon be replaced by quiet restoration. The weeks after my father's passing blurred together, grief weighing me down while my wife moved quickly, handling documents with a confidence that I mistook for support. I was too numb to question her actions, too consumed with the silence that lingered in the house without his voice, and in that haze, she began transferring assets into her name. She told relatives she was protecting the family, insisting that I was too fragile to deal with the responsibility, and they believed her because my quietness looked like weakness. At gatherings, she smiled while recounting how she secured the business, painting herself as the one who kept everything from slipping away. I stood nearby, listening to her rewrite the truth, watching relatives nod as if her lies had always been reality, and humiliation wrapped around me like a cloak I could not remove. I remembered the years of sacrifice when I balanced ledgers late at night, when I negotiated contracts under pressure, when I stayed behind to guard the stability of the business while others enjoyed holidays. My wife had once praised my discipline, but now she mocked it in front of others, describing me as cautious to the point of uselessness. She enjoyed the attention, enjoying how people laughed, while I swallowed every insult in silence. Each word cut deeper because I had trusted her, believing that loyalty bound us together, never imagining she would erase me so quickly. I replayed the memories of sacrifice, the decisions that cost me friends, the choices that delayed my own dreams, and I realized none of it mattered to her. My years of steadiness were dismissed in a moment, overshadowed by her charm and her performance. As weeks passed, I noticed red flags that confirmed my fears. She met with lawyers without telling me, hosting dinners where she announced her role as sole owner. She spent lavishly, throwing parties in the house my father had once walked through with careful steps, and each expense felt like another piece of him being buried again. Friends whispered that she was building something new, aligning herself with people who praised her ambition, while I was treated as a shadow left behind. I tried to warn a few trusted relatives, but they dismissed my words, telling me I needed to move forward and let her lead. The humiliation deepened because I realized no one believed in the years I had given, and my silence had turned me invisible. Still, beneath the pain, clarity began to grow. I remembered the contract I had insisted she sign years earlier, back when we first discussed inheritance, when she said such paperwork was unnecessary. I recalled her sigh as she scrawled her name, impatient to be finished, unaware of the weight she had just placed on the page. I had filed it away carefully, almost forgetting it existed, but now its presence returned to me like a quiet voice from my father himself. I understood that while she built her empire on performance, I had built mine on preparation, and preparation never fades. The humiliation I endured would not be the final chapter, because patience had already armed me with the proof I needed, and in silence, I began to prepare for the day when truth would speak louder than her charm. My wife's confidence grew bolder as weeks turned into months, and I began to see how carefully she positioned herself as the rightful owner of everything. At family gatherings, she spoke about the inheritance as though I had never existed, telling cousins and uncles that she had stepped in because I was too broken by grief. People nodded politely, agreeing with her version of events, and I stood nearby listening to my own life rewritten in her words. The humiliation felt unbearable, because I knew they believed her performance more than the quiet truth of my years of sacrifice. She hosted charity events in my father's name, smiling for cameras, while I stood in the background watching her take credit for everything he had built. Each speech chipped away at the image of me as heir, replacing it with a narrative where I was too weak to protect what had been left to me. Inside the house, the atmosphere shifted as well. Rooms that once carried my father's memory now echoed with voices of strangers she invited for dinners and celebrations. She purchased furniture without asking, redecorated spaces as though erasing the past, and laughed when I expressed discomfort. She told friends I was sentimental, clinging to traditions instead of embracing progress, and they laughed with her, mocking the man who had once been trusted with every decision. I felt like a guest in my own home, my authority stripped away piece by piece, while she grew stronger through the approval of others. Her alliance with Ethan, the lawyer she had brought into our lives, added another layer of betrayal. He became her partner in both strategy and confidence, guiding her through contracts and advising her on how to cut me out of decision-making entirely. I could see the admiration in her eyes when he spoke, and I recognized the danger in their partnership. Together, they crafted agreements that shifted ownership, drafted amendments that excluded me, and spoke about the future of the business as though I had no part in it. I understood then that this was not simply betrayal of trust, but an organized attempt to erase me from my father's legacy. Still, I did not fight openly, because anger would have played directly into their narrative. I carried the humiliation quietly, recording what I saw, memorizing details, and building patience around the knowledge of the contract I had kept safe. She believed I was defeated, that my silence confirmed her victory. But I knew the truth rested in ink she had once dismissed as meaningless. Each time she flaunted her control, I reminded myself that preparation outweighs arrogance, and that paper speaks louder than laughter when read in the right room. Her performances only convinced me further that the day of reckoning would come. I watched relatives applaud her speeches, listened to friends praise her ambition, and endured the whispers that I had failed my father's legacy. I let the humiliation sink deep into me, not to break me, but to sharpen my focus. Because beneath the surface, I carried the knowledge that all her boasting would crumble the moment the judge read aloud the contract she had forgotten, and I clung to that certainty as my shield in silence. I began to see patterns in her behavior that revealed how betrayal always grows slowly, like cracks in stone spreading until the entire structure collapses. She spoke of loyalty in public, but dismissed it in private, showing more excitement over new connections than over the sacrifices that had built our life. I remembered the countless nights when I worked late, balancing ledgers and protecting contracts, while she enjoyed the security those sacrifices gave her without ever acknowledging their cost. She had once praised my steadiness, but now she twisted it into weakness, telling others I lacked ambition, that I hid behind paperwork while she took real risks. The word spread through family and friends, and soon I felt surrounded by whispers that painted me as a man unworthy of what I had inherited. I recalled lessons from my father, who always said preparation is a form of love, and I realized how deeply those lessons shaped me. He made me sign documents carefully, review every clause, and protect every detail, even when I thought it unnecessary. At the time, I believed he was overly cautious, but now I saw the wisdom in his foresight. Among the files he left behind were amendments and clauses that secured my position, lines she never bothered to read because her arrogance blinded her to the importance of paper. I found them late at night in the study, surrounded by the scent of old leather and ink, and I felt my father's presence guiding me again. Those documents were my shield, and though I had endured humiliation, I understood that humiliation was only temporary when preparation stands waiting. The red flags multiplied as she grew careless with her confidence. She moved money into accounts she thought were hidden, not realizing I still had access to records through the accountant who remained loyal to me. She signed agreements with her lawyer, confident they would erase me. But I saw the mistakes they made, the missing witnesses, the dates that contradicted earlier filings. Every error became another stone in the wall I was quietly building, proof that arrogance always leaves traces. I cataloged everything, storing copies, encrypting files, and locking away originals, knowing that one day they would matter more than every insult I swallowed. I endured her performances in silence, because anger would have only confirmed her lies. She told people I was too broken to lead, but I knew patience was my greatest weapon. Betrayal thrives on reaction, and I refused to give her that satisfaction. Instead, I let her believe I was defeated, while inside, I carried the certainty that truth already belonged to me. My father's foresight had given me the tools, and my discipline kept them safe. Each time she laughed at me, each time she paraded her new power, I reminded myself that the document she signed without thought years earlier would one day return like a silent hammer. and when it fell, it would not only protect me but expose the emptiness of her empire. Her betrayal grew louder in public because she believed humiliation was the best way to erase my presence completely. At family dinners, she joked that I no longer handled the business because I was too cautious, telling stories where she cast herself as bold while I was painted as hesitant. Relatives laughed politely, some nervously, but few defended me, and I sat quietly while she basked in the attention. At charity events, she appeared beside her lawyer, smiling for photographers, insisting she had saved the inheritance from collapse, while I stood in the background, invisible in my own legacy. Each cheer for her cut deeper than any insult, because the applause felt like confirmation that sacrifice no longer mattered. I noticed how she began surrounding herself with allies who benefited from her spending. She hosted parties in the house my father once treated like sacred ground, inviting people who praised her ambition while ignoring the debt piling up behind her performances. She bought expensive furniture, redecorated rooms, and showed guests contracts she barely understood, boasting that the future was hers. I saw the danger in her recklessness, but I also saw opportunity, because arrogance leaves trails. Each purchase left receipts, each contract left dates, and I collected them quietly, knowing they would matter more than any defense I could speak aloud. The red flags grew clearer as I studied her partnership with Ethan. He advised her to rewrite ownership agreements, but their carelessness showed in missing signatures and conflicting clauses. I reviewed copies through contacts who remained loyal to me, and I recognized that their empire was fragile, built more on appearances than on solid legal ground. I began storing everything: emails, financial records, property transfers, creating a timeline that revealed not strength, but desperation. I knew the court would care little about gossip or humiliation, but it would care deeply about contradictions written in ink. At night, I sat in my father's study and compared her performance to his teachings. He always told me that the loudest person in the room is rarely the strongest, and his words returned with weight as I watched her transform into a figure defined by noise. I reminded myself that silence is not surrender. Silence is strategy. While she mocked me for being passive, I was building a fortress of proof, a shield that she had unknowingly signed herself years earlier. The humiliation remained heavy, but within it I found a strange strength. I no longer tried to correct relatives or explain myself to friends, because explanation without evidence is wasted breath. Instead, I let them believe her story, because their belief would make the truth more devastating when it arrived. I began to see betrayal not as chaos, but as a process that always ends in collapse. And I understood my role was to endure, to document, and to wait for the day when silence would finally outweigh spectacle. Her alliance with Ethan grew stronger, and together they began treating the inheritance as their personal stage for power. She walked into meetings with him at her side, presenting him as the new protector of the empire, while I sat silently, watching the empire my father built turned into a performance. She introduced him to relatives as the one who would ensure everything was handled properly, and soon people repeated his name with respect while mine faded into whispers. The humiliation cut deeply, because I realized they had rewritten me out of the very story I had lived for decades. Ethan's influence made her bolder, and the spending became reckless. She purchased cars she never needed, hosted extravagant dinners where she spoke about the future of the company, and used my father's legacy as the backdrop for her performances. She enjoyed standing in the center of rooms, laughing while others praised her vision, while I was pushed aside, treated like an old relic clinging to the past. I watched her dismiss loyal employees who questioned her decisions, replacing them with flatterers who nodded at every word. Each dismissal left a scar on the company, and I recorded each one, collecting names, dates, and testimonies. I knew these details would matter when silence gave way to proof. I remembered a night years earlier when my father taught me the importance of contracts. He told me charm fades, but a signed page outlasts speeches, and those words echoed in my mind as I endured humiliation. Ethan relied on performance and arrogance, but neither of them cared for details. They signed documents hastily, ignored clauses, and treated paperwork as a nuisance. I, however, studied every line, storing copies of every reckless decision they made. Their carelessness became my strength, because I knew the law did not honor appearances, it honored records. The betrayal grew unbearable in public venues, where she stood beside Ethan as if he were her true partner, dismissing me with every smile. She told people I lacked courage, that I wasted opportunities, and the laughter that followed felt like a knife turned slowly. Yet I refused to react, because I knew rage would only confirm their story. I endured the humiliation with silence, even when it hollowed me out, because patience would transform my pain into strategy. I reminded myself that lawful revenge requires discipline, not anger, and each insult became another stone in the wall I was building. In private, I continued preparing quietly. I organized documents into timelines, photographed receipts beside newspapers for proof, and gathered notarized pages that bore her signature. I reviewed the contract she once dismissed, remembering her impatience when she signed it, and I felt a steady calm knowing that it would one day outweigh all her boasting. She believed the empire was hers, but the truth rested in ink that could not be erased. And though I walked through each day carrying humiliation, I also carried certainty that when the time came, her laughter would collapse under the quiet weight of paper. I watched her confidence grow reckless, and with Ethan at her side, she believed no boundary could stop her, but arrogance always blinds people to details that matter most. She began tampering with assets she did not fully understand, moving accounts between banks, attempting to rewrite clauses in agreements, and signing papers that looked powerful but held fatal errors. I recognized the danger immediately, because I had once sat with my father as he explained why inheritance protections required signatures, witnesses, and notarization to remain valid. He told me mistakes pile up when people chase speed, and I could see those mistakes multiplying in her every move. I spent nights reviewing old records, lining up contracts, comparing dates, and checking signatures carefully. I saw where her amendments contradicted earlier filings, where transfers lacked proper witnesses, and where Ethan's overconfidence led him to ignore legal requirements. Each error became part of my growing archive, proof that her empire was not built on strength, but on arrogance. I documented everything, scanning, photographing, and storing copies in secure locations, knowing that when the time came, the law would speak louder than her laughter. The humiliation continued in public, but I wore it like armor. She mocked me at dinners, saying I clung to paperwork while she built the future, and people laughed as though she had already won. Yet I reminded myself that laughter fades, but ink remains, and I found strength in that truth. Her arrogance fueled my patience, because I understood that betrayal cannot be confronted with rage. It must be dismantled with proof. My silence unsettled her more than anger would have, because she mistook it for weakness, never realizing it was preparation. I noticed cracks in her alliances as well. Some relatives whispered concerns about her spending, employees questioned her dismissals, and even close friends avoided her extravagant displays. They sensed what she ignored, that appearances cannot hold when evidence collapses beneath them. I stayed quiet, letting them doubt her naturally, because persuasion was unnecessary when her own actions exposed her. I carried myself with calm steadiness, refusing to play the role she wrote for me, and in that refusal, I regained a measure of control. At night, I returned again to the contract she had signed years earlier, the one she treated as unimportant, and I read each line slowly. I remembered her impatience when she placed her name on the page, unaware that it bound her forever to the limitations my father insisted on. That contract was more than paper. It was the silent proof of foresight, the weapon I never had to forge because my father had already crafted it. I felt his presence in that moment, guiding me to trust patience, reminding me that dignity is not lost when mocked. It is lost only when abandoned. And I promised myself I would carry his lesson until the day the contract was read aloud and her empire of arrogance finally collapsed. I realized that direct confrontation would only feed her performance, so I chose a quieter path, withdrawing from her stage while strengthening my position behind the scenes. I began by restructuring my own routines, limiting conversations to essentials, and avoiding every situation where she could twist my words into weakness. She noticed my silence and mocked it, telling others I had surrendered. But in truth, I was building distance between her noise and my strategy. I separated accounts, secured documents, and created backups stored where her hands could never reach. Each step was deliberate, not driven by anger but by preparation, because I understood that betrayal feeds on reaction, and silence denies it oxygen. At the house, I no longer sat in crowded rooms where she flaunted her alliances. I spent evenings in my father's study, surrounded by his files, revisiting every contract, and placing markers on pages that would one day speak for me. I kept the atmosphere of that room calm, treating it like a sanctuary where humiliation lost its weight and clarity returned. I studied dates, signatures, and amendments, aligning them into a timeline that revealed her mistakes with merciless precision. She thought my retreat meant defeat, but it was the first act of discipline, the quiet step before lawful revenge. She continued parading Ethan through public gatherings, boasting about the empire they were shaping, and people clapped as if their words were already truth. I endured the humiliation without a word because I saw how their arrogance blinded them to details. They ignored witnesses on contracts, overlooked notarization requirements, and failed to register changes properly, mistakes that would unravel everything when exposed under light. I noted every flaw, storing copies carefully, because I knew the law does not reward charm, it rewards preparation. In private, I spoke less and listened more. Friends who still respected me revealed whispers of her spending, rumors of her careless deals, and doubts about her stability. I did not spread those whispers further because gossip fades, but I cataloged them quietly, building context that matched the evidence I held. I knew every rumor would find its proof eventually, and I wanted to be ready when it did. My calm unsettled her more than arguments would have, because she expected rage, and without it, she had nothing to twist against me. I learned to let silence become my answer, and in that silence, I rebuilt my strength. Each evening, I left the study feeling steadier, because I carried the certainty that truth was already mine, resting in pages she signed without thought. Betrayal thrives on chaos, but I refused to give her that satisfaction. Instead, I chose order, and in that order, I began to recover the dignity she tried so hard to erase. She believed she was winning, but in reality, she was only playing louder while I secured the quiet that would one day bring her empire crashing down. Depositions became the moment where her confidence finally collided with the weight of proof. Because words that once dazzled relatives now had to stand against records. She entered the room with Ethan by her side, both of them certain they would frame me as absent and useless, insisting that I had surrendered responsibility long before my father's passing. I listened in silence as they spoke with rehearsed ease, painting me as someone too cautious, too sentimental, too weak to manage what I had inherited. Their arrogance filled the room, but discovery is patient, and discovery waits for contradictions to appear. When my counsel requested supporting documents, their story began to unravel. They produced files missing signatures, contracts without witnesses, and amendments that directly contradicted earlier filings. I watched the certainty fade from their faces as dates were questioned and gaps appeared that no performance could fill. I provided records that bore my initials, correspondence that showed my direct involvement, and receipts proving I had funded filings years before. The contrast was undeniable, and suddenly their narrative of me as absent collapsed under the weight of undeniable proof. The digital trail proved even more damaging. Emails revealed Ethan mocking clauses he never read, messages showed my wife admitting she signed without paying attention, and bank transfers highlighted spending disguised as strategy. Each document aligned perfectly with the timeline I had built in my father's study, exposing the pattern of arrogance they believed invisible. Witnesses confirmed my presence in critical negotiations, while they struggled to explain their absence, and the silence that followed each contradiction felt heavier than any accusation. Humiliation had once defined me in public gatherings, but now it shifted onto them. My calm refusal to argue unsettled them more than anger ever could, because they expected me to defend myself loudly, and instead, I let the paper defend me. Ethan grew defensive, pressing harder, but each push only revealed more cracks, and even my wife's confidence began to tremble when confronted with her own careless signatures. Discovery was not dramatic in sound, but it was devastating in substance because truth has no need for spectacle. I left the deposition rooms with a steady calm, carrying not triumph, but certainty. The humiliation I endured at her dinners and public events no longer mattered, because those memories were being overwritten by proof. I understood then that lawful revenge is not about striking back in anger, but about letting the careless destroy themselves with their own signatures and arrogance. Each line of evidence was a brick in the wall that would eventually close around her, and I carried that knowledge like armor, preparing for the final moment when the contract I preserved would silence her claims forever. The courtroom was the stage where months of humiliation finally met the weight of proof, and unlike the public gatherings where charm and noise ruled, here only documents mattered. She entered with Ethan at her side, confident and smiling, speaking to the judge as if victory was already hers. She demanded ownership of the business, the house, the accounts, presenting herself as the rightful heir to everything my father had entrusted to me. The room believed her confidence, relatives in the gallery nodding while whispers painted me as already defeated. I sat silently, letting her performance run its course, because I knew the moment would come when paper would cut through her theater. When her lawyer finished listing demands, I opened my folder and slid one contract across the table. The judge lifted it, adjusted his glasses, and began reading aloud. Each line was simple, precise, and undeniable, outlining protections my father had insisted upon, signed by her years earlier when she considered it a meaningless formality. The words carried more force than any speech, and as they filled the courtroom, I watched her expression falter. The smile that had mocked me for months disappeared, and her hands trembled as the reality of her signature closed around her. Ethan leaned forward, searching for loopholes, but there were none, because arrogance cannot erase notarization and dates. The gallery shifted in silence as relatives realized the truth they had ignored. Their nods of support for her became uneasy glances toward me, the man they once called too weak, too cautious, too sentimental. I did not look at them, because their opinions no longer mattered. What mattered was the record now read into law, the contract she had signed without thought, and the judgment that followed with calm precision. The court struck her claims to ownership, restricted her access to assets, and acknowledged the protections my father had set in place for me. It was not dramatic, but it was absolute, and in that quiet certainty, humiliation finally loosened its grip on me. I left the courtroom without celebration, because dignity does not require applause. She had tried to erase me with laughter, with whispers, and with arrogance, but preparation had spoken louder than her noise. The contract I preserved had been my shield, and it had restored what months of betrayal had taken from me. I walked past the benches filled with eyes that once pitied me, and for the first time since my father's passing, I felt the weight of grief give way to clarity. The empire remained intact, not because I shouted louder, but because I trusted patience, discipline, and foresight. And as the judge's words echoed in my mind, I understood that lawful revenge requires no spectacle, only the steady weight of truth written in ink. The aftermath of the judgment revealed itself not in celebration, but in the quiet shifts of power that followed. My wife, once so confident in public, now moved through gatherings with unease, her smile strained, her laughter brittle, while relatives who once praised her ambition avoided her eyes. The same people who dismissed me as cautious now approached cautiously themselves, offering small acknowledgments, hesitant apologies, and words framed as concern. I accepted none of it directly, because dignity is not rebuilt through explanations. It is rebuilt through consistency, and I knew time would reveal the difference between spectacle and stability. The business responded faster than the family. Clients who had hesitated under her careless promises began to return, their contracts coming back across my desk not because I chased them, but because they trusted the steadiness I had always carried. Employees who had been dismissed under her rule reached out quietly, asking if there was still a place for them, and I welcomed them back with contracts that offered the security they once lacked. Every signature I gave them felt like another stone laid in the foundation my father had built. Proof that loyalty rewarded discipline in the end. The empire steadied itself around patience, not noise, and I knew then that my silence had spoken louder than her speeches ever could. She tried to salvage her image outside the courtroom, turning to social circles and online platforms to declare herself the victim of betrayal. She told anyone willing to listen that I had used hidden documents to trap her unfairly, painting herself as powerless against a cold husband with a ruthless plan. But her words carried no weight anymore, because the record was already set in court, notarized, stamped, and read aloud for all to hear. Even Ethan, her supposed ally, distanced himself when the reality became clear, because no lawyer protects a client whose arrogance signed away her own defense. Her empire of noise collapsed into whispers no one wanted to repeat. At home, I walked through the halls of the house that had once felt like hers more than mine, and I restored them piece by piece. I cleared away the extravagant furniture she purchased to impress guests, returning the rooms to the quiet dignity my father had always valued. In his study, I placed the judgment beside the old ledgers, treating it not as a trophy but as proof that foresight survives betrayal. I thought about how many nights I had endured humiliation in silence, and I realized that patience had not been weakness. It had been strength sharpened by time. The humiliation no longer burned because it had served its purpose. It had forced me to prepare, to remain steady, and to trust that truth would speak when the moment came. My wife's collapse in court was not my triumph. It was the natural consequence of arrogance meeting foresight. The inheritance remained mine not through shouting but through discipline, and as I carried forward with steady steps, I understood that lawful revenge never destroys. It restores. And in that restoration, I finally recovered the dignity she tried so hard to erase. The business required rebuilding after the courtroom decision. But this time, it was not through noise or appearances. It was through consistency and structure. I walked the factory floor where the hum of machines reminded me of my father's steady presence, and I greeted workers who had once looked uncertain under her careless reign. Their nods carried relief because they knew stability had returned, and I promised myself that payroll, benefits, and dignity would never again be threatened by arrogance disguised as leadership. I did not give speeches or demand applause. I simply showed up every day, signing checks, answering questions, and proving that loyalty to workers was more powerful than empty promises. In the office, I focused on repairing what she and Ethan had broken. I reinstated employees who had been dismissed unfairly, offering them new contracts that recognized their years of loyalty. I reviewed the books line by line, cutting away wasteful spending and redirecting funds into training, maintenance, and long-term security. Vendors who had once hesitated to extend credit returned when they saw invoices paid on time, and clients renewed their agreements without hesitation. The empire slowly regained its shape, not through spectacle, but through discipline, and I felt the weight of humiliation finally lifting from my shoulders. At home, I began restoring the spaces she had turned into stages for her performances. I removed the extravagant decorations she purchased to impress guests, returning the house to the quiet dignity my father had valued. In his study, I organized files into new binders, labeling them carefully, preparing for future storms I now understood would always come. I treated the judgment not as a trophy, but as a reminder that preparation is love expressed through ink and foresight. Each time I sat at that desk, I felt his presence again, guiding me to choose restraint over rage, patience over spectacle. Relatives who once applauded her ambition now returned with cautious words, attempting to repair their distance. But I met them with silence. I understood now that forgiveness was not required for dignity to return. Their opinions no longer defined me, because the truth had already been recorded and preserved in the judgment. I carried myself with calm steadiness, knowing that consistency would speak louder than any explanation ever could. Betrayal had once hollowed me out, but it had also sharpened me, teaching me that strength lies not in defending against every insult, but in building something no insult can erase. The humiliation that once felt unbearable had transformed into clarity. I had endured laughter, whispers, and mockery, but I had survived with the legacy intact, and survival was victory enough. My wife faded into the background, her noise no longer carrying weight, while I moved forward with the discipline that had always been my strength. The empire was never about applause. It was about responsibility. And responsibility is what I carried now, steady and unshaken. The story had shifted, not through anger or revenge, but through patience, proof, and the quiet certainty that dignity restored speaks louder than any performance. The courthouse steps were quiet when I walked outside, but even without an audience, I felt the echo of everything that had just ended. Months of humiliation, whispers, and laughter had carried me here, yet the silence afterward felt heavier than any noise. I did not smile or celebrate, because dignity is not a performance. It is the steady presence that remains when falsehoods collapse. The judgment rested in my briefcase, stamped and final, and its weight reminded me that truth, though patient, always arrives. I thought of my wife, who once stood so confidently at dinners, mocking me while others applauded, and I remembered how easily people believed her stories. They had clapped for her as if charm created empires, forgetting that my father's legacy had been built through sacrifice and structure. Now those same people avoided her eyes, their silence betraying regret, while the record of her defeat lived in the contract she once signed without thought. Arrogance had blinded her, but foresight had protected me. And foresight was the one lesson my father never let me forget. I returned to the house she had turned into a stage, and I walked through each room quietly, reclaiming them piece by piece. I removed the furniture bought to impress strangers, restoring the spaces to the calm dignity my father valued. In his study, I placed the judgment beside the old ledgers, not as a trophy, but as proof that preparation endures betrayal. I felt his presence in that moment, as though he had guided me all along, ensuring I understood that patience is not weakness but discipline sharpened by time. The business followed the same rhythm of restoration. Employees who had once feared instability now worked with steadier hands, knowing their paychecks no longer depended on arrogance. Clients signed contracts with renewed trust, telling me they valued silence and consistency over spectacle. Each day, I rebuilt not by speeches but by actions, proving again that loyalty is earned through responsibility, not applause. The empire stood because I had not abandoned the lessons that once seemed excessive, but had turned out to be salvation. The humiliation that once hollowed me no longer carried weight, because it had forced me to endure, to prepare, and to trust discipline over anger. My wife's downfall was not my victory. It was the natural end of arrogance colliding with truth. I carried no triumph in my steps, only clarity. I had survived betrayal without rage, restored dignity without spectacle, and protected what my father left without destroying myself in the process. And as I closed the study door behind me, I understood the final lesson: that lawful revenge is not about winning. It is about ensuring nothing built on sacrifice is ever erased. Don't forget to hit like, subscribe, and turn on the bell so you don't miss the next story. Write in the comments from which city you are watching.